Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The road into Aku Hills twisted like a sleeping serpent, narrow and silent, lined with bottlebrush trees that never shed all their secrets. The town itself wore the scent of clay and wood smoke, tucked far enough from the main highway that only people born there, or lost, ever found it. Its people carried the gift and curse of remembering everything and forgiving almost nothing. Doors creaked not just from rust, but from conversations long buried in hinges. There was a certain rhythm to the town's gossip, too, soft and circular, like wind passing through papaya leaves. Among its residents, Mary Alden was neither feared nor admired, simply there, like the mountain that loomed in the distance, always watching but never asking for anything. She had come to Aku Hills nearly 11 years ago, not on the wings of drama, but through a quiet rental ad posted at the local post office. Wife of Jonathan Alden, people called her at first, as though she were property tucked neatly behind his name. Jonathan, a man of noise and noise alone, was impossible to miss. A handshake from him could snap a wrist. He dressed like success, and walked like he'd paved the streets himself. If Aku Hills had a mayor, unofficial or otherwise, it was Jonathan. Yet, behind the showmanship was something slippery, like oil hiding in puddles. The way his laugh rang hollow when no one else joined in. The way his voice dropped when he said Mary's name, not like a husband, but a hunter calling a hound. Still, no one looked too hard. People in Aku Hills preferred their truths brewed weak and served warm. Mary's days unfolded with the consistency of church bells, measured, polite, distant. At sunrise, she'd tie her faded scarf, water the plants in mismatched pots outside their weather-stained porch, then disappear into the kitchen where the scent of hibiscus soap always lingered on her hands. She ran a soap stall at the weekend market, her booth tucked neatly between Madame Elisa's herbs and Aji's raw honey. Her soaps were well-crafted, gentle on the skin, wrapped in brown paper with twine bows, always labeled in tidy cursive. But it wasn't the soap that drew attention, it was her silence. People spoke to Mary like one talks to the wind, not expecting much back, just filling space. She nodded, sometimes smiled, never shared more than was required. If a customer asked how she was doing, her answer was always some version of "I'm all right, thank you." Some mistook her reserve for pride, others for shyness. But the truth, if anyone had dared dig, was that Mary had learned to live in stillness because noise, in her world, always came at a cost. At home, her voice had value only when it echoed Jonathan's. If it didn't, it was flattened under lectures, slammed doors, or long, trembling silences. He didn't hit her often, not enough to leave marks that couldn't be hidden, but the way he weaponized words was like salt rubbed into wounds no one could see. "You think you're better than me?" he'd sneer. "You're nothing without me, Mary. Nothing." And she'd stand there, hands damp with dish soap, heart beating 1,000 times too fast, mouth shut tight enough to keep the truth from spilling. Their house sat at the edge of town, where streetlights faded and crickets dared to be louder. It had the kind of porch made for storytelling, but none was ever told there. The neighbors noticed things, of course. The porch light often stayed off. The windows were always drawn, even on hot nights. Jonathan's car returned late, sometimes reeking of perfume that wasn't Mary's scent. But nothing was ever said aloud. Aku Hills had a way of respecting distance, even if it meant ignoring cries muffled behind drywall. Mary moved through her own home, like a ghost tied to duty. Her meals were never late. Her clothes never wrinkled. Her words, when they came, were filtered through calculation, as though every syllable passed through a maze before reaching her lips. Yet, behind those careful movements lived an entire woman no one truly knew. In the attic were boxes no one had opened in years, scrapbooks without wedding photos, journals that never spoke of love, certificates and old ID cards tucked so deep they might as well have belonged to someone else. And they did. Before she became Mary Alden, she had another name. A name soaked in stories. A name with a spine. But like an old quilt hidden away during summer, that version of herself had been folded up and forgotten. Or so she thought. It began unraveling the day she stood too long in the mirror. She had been brushing her hair, something she rarely did with care, when she noticed a faint line along her cheek, not from age but tension. A permanent memory of a slap that hadn't quite healed. Something inside her shifted, quiet as the tremble of a feather but undeniable. The next morning, she didn't go to the market. Instead, she sat by the window and watched the sun rise without rushing to meet it. That afternoon, she walked into the post office, not to send a parcel but to collect the form for legal separation. The woman behind the counter blinked, unsure whether to ask questions or fetch the form. Mary said nothing, but offered a smile so weary it could have curled paint. By sunset, the news had spread, not because Mary told anyone, but because silence that heavy couldn't help but echo. At first, folks assumed Jonathan had filed. "He's probably tired of her mood swings," someone said at the bar. "She's a lovely woman, but too quiet," muttered another. "Still waters run deep," one old man added, scratching his beard. But none of them knew how deep. And none of them were prepared for the undercurrent that would rise and change everything they thought they understood about the woman who always smiled just enough, and never more. Rain had threatened the sky that morning, but by mid-morning it held its breath, clouds like thick cotton waiting to burst. The courthouse stood at the end of Welkin Street, its old bricks wearing years of whispered justice. A building that looked too small to hold anything heavy, but today it brimmed with invisible weight. The bell above its door had rusted from disuse, but on this day it would chime too many times to count. Curious feet tapped the front steps, not all of them invited. Townsfolk who had never set foot in the courtroom found reasons to wander nearby. Some claimed they were on their way to the post office, others said they had business at the tax clerk's desk, but they all circled back toward the narrow wooden benches just outside the hearing room. Faces leaned slightly forward when her name was called. Mary Alden versus Jonathan Alden. Not out of recognition, but expectation. Whispers passed from lips to ears like coals between fire starters. It was the same old town routine. Carve the woman open with rumors, wrap the man in excuse. She must have lost her mind. One woman muttered to the shopkeeper beside her. "You know how quiet women are. They let things build up, and then boom." But no one expected the silence to take form and walk through the door wearing dignity like a well-fitted shawl. Mary didn't stride or shrink. She walked in like she was returning to her own spine. Her dress was plain and unbothered by fashion. Her shoes were scuffed at the heel. She wore no earrings, no rings, no watch, just herself. Her hair was pulled into a knot at the back, neat but not rigid, as though she had spent the time she might have used for mascara in stillness instead. She did not look around to greet or acknowledge anyone. She didn't scan for familiar faces, nor offer apologies for arriving. It was the kind of entrance made by someone who had already rehearsed every gaze that might be thrown her way. Jonathan was seated across the aisle, leaning slightly back in his chair like a man who expected applause. He wore a tailored suit with a boutonniere he hadn't removed since a meeting that morning, and his smile was wide enough to touch both corners of the room. He looked at her the way a man looks at a puzzle he already solved, casual, dismissive, dangerously smug. His lawyer, a young man with a tie too tight and too red, whispered something that made Jonathan chuckle under his breath. And yet, for all his flair and forwardness, his eyes darted toward the entrance more than once. There was something unsettled in him, like he knew there was more to this hearing than he had prepared for, but pride wrapped around his chest like armor, and he wore it tightly. He expected submission, a quick agreement, a sigh, a signature, and then freedom. What he didn't expect was the judge's response. Justice Harold Gomer had served in that courthouse longer than many remembered. His reputation was carved from stone, not because he was particularly fierce, but because he was immovable, unbending, fair without favor. He entered the courtroom through the side door, eyes clear and steps steady, holding a stack of documents like they weighed nothing. But the moment his gaze met Mary's, his steps slowed, almost imperceptibly, like a man recognizing a melody from a past life. He paused mid-stride, blinked once, and then, without explanation, adjusted his robe and stood fully upright, facing her. In that suspended moment, the room shifted. Air pulled tight. Every seated body felt it in their spine. The clerk looked up from her notebook. Jonathan turned his head, frowning. The silence inside the walls did not ring, it pulsed. And then the judge did something no one in Aku Hills had ever seen in that room. He nodded his head, not the stiff, habitual courtesy of authority, but a respectful tilt, deliberate and silent. "Mrs. Alden," he said, voice more gravel than air, "please have a seat." She did not blink. She did not rush. She walked toward the chair reserved for her and sat without a word. Her spine didn't touch the backrest. She folded her hands, not to fidget, but to hold herself in place. And though she was just one woman, seated among walls that had seen too much injustice disguised as paperwork, she made the room feel too small for anything dishonest. Paper rustled. The gavel had not struck yet, but the hearing had already begun in spirit. Jonathan's lawyer cleared his throat, unbuttoned his jacket, and began with an opening statement so drenched in pretense it could have watered crops. "My client," he said, gesturing as if performing on stage, "has endured great emotional pressure. His wife, though soft-spoken, has created an environment difficult to live in. Her silence, at times, has been used as a weapon." Mary said nothing, but her lawyer, an unfamiliar face in Aku Hills, shifted slightly. He wore no smugness, no bravado. He opened his folder with the care of a man reading from Scripture, and he did not interrupt the first lawyer. Jonathan's defense went on for several minutes, painting him as a misunderstood husband, a victim of emotional distance. "She's withdrawn, unpredictable, and unwilling to communicate. He tried everything, Your Honor, marriage counseling, prayer groups, patience, but eventually, even a man's spirit wears thin." Jonathan nodded solemnly, casting sideways glances at those watching, as though waiting for heads to nod in agreement. But the nods never came, only stillness. Mary's lawyer remained still until the speech ended with a long, performative sigh. Then slowly he stood, not to perform, but to present. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he placed a thick folder on the judge's bench. "With your permission, Your Honor, I'd like to present a few materials. Just the truth." There was no flourish, no drama, only pages, and the weight of things buried for far too long. Inside the folder were fragments of a life lived in quiet desperation. Receipts showing drained accounts, photos taken of bruises that faded before they were noticed, voicemail transcripts with threats whispered through clenched teeth, and finally, video clips. Footage from a small camera she had hidden inside a ceramic owl on their kitchen shelf. Jonathan shouting, pacing, slamming chairs, threatening her, mocking her, once even grabbing her by the arm hard enough to leave fingerprints. The room watched with breath caught between horror and disbelief. And then came something no one expected. Documents signed years ago, backdated, proving Mary had tried to separate from him long before she filed. Every attempt was blocked, manipulated, or ignored. There were letters he never let her send. Applications for jobs he shredded. Bank transfers he reversed. The picture that formed was not of a cold woman, but a prisoner dressed in soft smiles. As the last clip faded, the courtroom sat frozen in the hush only truth can bring. No eyes dared meet hers. Not out of pity, but out of reckoning. In that moment, the town began to understand. Mary Alden had not just walked into that courthouse to end a marriage. She had walked in to open a wound everyone pretended didn't exist. And now that it was open, bleeding, honest, undeniable, no one could pretend they hadn't seen it. The hallway outside the courtroom felt colder than it should have. Even with the sun warming the tiled windows from the outside, there was something in the air that didn't sit right. A draft of memory, a gust of things unspoken. No one moved for a long moment after the first session adjourned. People sat with backs stiff and eyes lowered, like children waiting to be called into the principal's office. Even the courthouse clerk, who was known for her humming habit between sessions, had fallen into silence. What they had seen had shaken something loose inside them, not just about Mary, but about themselves. It was not the bruises or the recordings that disturbed them the most. It was the realization that it had all happened while they nodded to her in passing, bought soap from her stall, borrowed sugar from her, and said thank you, with the same mouths that now whispered regret. People began to remember odd things. A day she wore sunglasses, even when it rained. The time she stumbled while carrying a box at the market and apologized too many times. The way Jonathan always stood a little too close when she spoke to another man. Looking back, it had been there all along, not in what she said, but in the things she never corrected. The silences that weren't empty, but loud with survival. And now, they couldn't look at her the same way. The woman they once called meek was something else entirely. Something rare. Something made of more than just quiet. Inside the judge's office, the atmosphere was different, not tense, but weighty, like a sealed box no one dared open. Justice Gomer sat behind his desk with fingers laced tightly, staring down at a photo frame turned backward. His robe hung loosely at the shoulder, his glasses perched low, untouched since he removed them. In front of him lay Mary's folder. Not the one with the bruises and bank records, but the one his clerk had handed him discreetly, documents he had requested privately the moment he recognized her face. Though decades older and dressed in a new name, her eyes were still the same, alert, guarded, searching. He remembered her well, even if it had taken a second glance to confirm it. Years ago, when he was still a district judge in another city, She had worked alongside public defenders and private investigators. She wasn't loud then either, but she had a kind of clarity that could slice through deception like a well-honed blade. They had crossed paths during a case involving his own daughter, a situation so tangled and dangerous that most had advised him to bury it in silence. But Mary, then known by her maiden name, hadn't hesitated. She dug until the truth bled out. Because of her, his daughter escaped a man who nearly destroyed her. He had never properly thanked her, and after that case she vanished. Burned bridges, changed addresses, dropped off the map like a bird flying into fog. Seeing her again was like finding a relic you didn't know you were missing. He hadn't stood out of pity. He hadn't stood out of theatrics. It was respect, earned and rare. He knew then that this case was not what it seemed. It wasn't just a marriage falling apart, not a simple courtroom resolution. It was an unveiling, years in the making, and he understood that he stood not only before a woman seeking a divorce, but before a woman returning to herself. The law had limits, he knew. Paper and ink could only do so much. But he had no intention of allowing this trial to become another meaningless legal dance. When he returned to the courtroom, he carried that weight with him, not as burden, but as duty. He sat down, adjusted his robe, and asked for the next witness. Mary's neighbor, an elderly woman who had lived beside her for 8 years, was the first to speak. Her voice trembled with the kind of guilt that grows in the bones. She admitted she had heard things. Not always clear, not always violent, but wrong nonetheless. "I thought maybe it wasn't my place," she said, staring at the floor. "I didn't want to stir trouble." Then came a teenage boy who had once helped Mary with groceries. He always looked angry, he said of Jonathan. Like she was a problem he was too tired to solve. Each voice added a thread to the fabric of truth. And Jonathan, once smug and reclining, now sat stiffly, arms folded so tightly it seemed he was holding himself together by force. But even as evidence piled high and eyes turned cold, Jonathan tried to summon the charm that had worked for years. He called for a recess, met privately with his lawyer, and returned with the slick air of reinvention. Taking the stand himself, he turned on the tears. "I loved my wife," he began, voice catching just enough to appear sincere. "I provided for her, gave her everything. If I got angry sometimes, it's because I felt invisible in my own home." He spoke of the pressures of business, the isolation of a one-sided marriage, and how Mary often withheld intimacy without cause. He painted himself as a man drowning in affection unreturned, twisting truth into the shape of a story he could survive. Some eyes in the room softened. One juror nodded slightly. But the judge did not move. He watched Jonathan like a seasoned reader watches a predictable novel. Mary, on the other hand, did not flinch. She did not cry. Her silence was no longer a shield, it was a mirror, one that refused to lie. When asked if she had a response to her husband's testimony, she rose, not hurriedly, but with the gravity of someone who had rehearsed honesty in her mind 1,000 times. "He is not lying," she said simply. "He's just only telling the part that favors him. And I am done being the shadow that makes his story look brighter." Her words landed without volume, but their weight split the courtroom like lightning through oak. The sun had shifted by the time court resumed, casting long shadows across the polished floor tiles, as if the building itself had grown tired of holding so many unspoken truths. A stillness hung over the room like mist after rainfall, heavy but not suffocating, just enough to make people uncomfortable. The courtroom was quieter now, not out of boredom, but from the weight of recognition. There was no more pretending that what was happening could be shrugged off as a bitter quarrel between spouses. This wasn't the drama of discontent. It was the unspooling of years sewn tight by fear, carefully unraveled by hands that had trembled too long. Mary's seat remained fixed, unmoved throughout the proceedings, as though bolted into the floor. She did not whisper to her lawyer or glance at the gallery. She sat the way a tree sits in the middle of a forgotten field, anchored, dignified, and unwilling to be moved by wind, no matter how loud it howled. Her stillness was no longer a mystery to the room. It had transformed into its own language, one that spoke of endurance without having to raise a single word. Jonathan, across from her, had grown quiet too. The smugness that once clung to him like cologne had faded, replaced by the faint twitch of a jaw too tightly held. Even when his lawyer leaned in to offer whispered encouragement, he responded with curt nods and a clenched fist resting beneath the table. The performance he had begun earlier was beginning to fray at the edges. A surprise witness was called, someone even Mary hadn't expected. It was Doreen, the woman who had cleaned the Alden house every Thursday for nearly 6 years. She entered the room with hesitation, wiping her hands on the hem of her skirt as if scrubbing off the weight of her decision to speak. People knew her as loyal and discreet, the kind of housekeeper who minded her business and never said more than necessary. But when she took the stand, her voice, though low, was unshaken. "I kept quiet because I thought that was the rule," she began, eyes scanning the wood grain in front of her rather than the crowd. "I figured what happened in someone's home wasn't for me to talk about. But silence can feel like guilt when you hold it too long." Her testimony wasn't dramatic. She didn't describe screams or broken glass. Instead, she told of 1,000 small things, things that had never been part of her job but became part of her routine. A broken dish here, a rearranged picture frame that had once hidden a dent in the wall, a scarf left in the freezer, soaked with melted ice, likely to soothe a bruise she hadn't dared ask about. She recalled a moment when Mary had thanked her too many times after a simple task, like gratitude was a shield she had to wear to keep herself from falling apart. The details didn't scream. They whispered, but their truth rang louder than anything Jonathan's defense could counter. It wasn't one moment of violence. It was the slow erosion of safety. That, Doreen explained, was the real damage. Jonathan's expression darkened as Doreen stepped down. He tugged at his cufflinks, adjusted his tie, and offered the court a thin-lipped smile that cracked at the edges. He leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something with urgency, but whatever strategy he was grasping at had already unraveled. There was nowhere else to point the blame. The room had seen too much, heard too clearly. The judge, who had been mostly silent through the testimonies, finally leaned forward, hands clasped as if cradling something fragile. He studied Jonathan in a way that felt more like measurement than judgment. "You've had your voice for the better part of this marriage," he said slowly, the kind of slow that makes a person sit straighter. "We've heard it. We've watched how you used it. But I don't believe we've seen your truth." The words weren't loud, but they landed with force, like rocks dropped in still water. Jonathan opened his mouth to respond, but for once, no words came out. A pause stretched, longer than comfort allowed, and then Mary stood. She didn't ask for permission to speak. She didn't wait for her lawyer's nod. She rose as if called by something deeper than protocol. "I know how this ends," she said. "I walk away, he walks away, and this town goes quiet again. That's how it always goes." She turned slightly, not to address Jonathan, but to face the people seated behind her, the same people who had bought her soap, greeted her in passing, and looked away when her silence had started to scream. "But I need you to know something," she said. "You weren't wrong to think I was quiet. You were wrong to think I had nothing to say." The silence that followed her words was not hollow. It pulsed with reckoning. In the back row, someone cleared their throat. Another shifted in their seat. These were not dramatic reactions, just small signs that the room was breathing again. The judge nodded once, not as a gesture of approval, but as a mark of understanding. He turned to the clerk and asked for the last piece of evidence to be submitted. It was a handwritten letter. Mary had written it months earlier, never intending to share it, addressed to no one specifically. Her lawyer found it among her case files and added it quietly, believing it mattered. In it, Mary had written of a house filled with echoes, of conversations where she had to study her husband's moods like weather patterns, of nights where she would walk from room to room not because she was cleaning, but because moving felt safer than sitting still. She wrote of wanting to disappear not from the town, but from herself, because even her reflection no longer recognized her. The words weren't poetic, they were raw, plain, and true. As the judge read a few lines aloud, the weight of them folded over the room like wool. This was not just a case file anymore. It was a life being laid bare, stitched together by years of silent hope and the final resolve to be heard. The session was adjourned for the day. Mary did not rush out. She stood for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for the past to finally loosen its grip. And slowly, quietly, the courtroom emptied, leaving behind the echo of a truth no one could unhear. The courthouse seemed to hold its breath when the trial resumed the next morning. Not a soul shuffled in late. Not a whisper floated between benches. Even the wind outside had gone still, as if the trees themselves had paused to listen. Every eye that fell on Mary carried a new kind of weight, not curiosity, not sympathy, but something harder to define. A reckoning, perhaps. Some looked ashamed. Others looked confused. But all looked, and that in itself marked a shift. Mary walked in with the same quiet posture, her dress once again plain, her hair in the same knot, but there was something else in her now, a stillness so grounded it refused to be swayed by the room. She no longer looked like someone appearing in a courtroom. She looked like someone bearing witness to her own return. Jonathan was already seated. He didn't look up when she passed. He kept his eyes locked on a notepad he hadn't written in, his pen idle between his fingers. The man who once believed he could steer every room he entered was now a figure hunched in reflection, surrounded by silence that didn't pity him. If regret had a face, it might have looked like his, but it was difficult to tell if it was regret for what he had done or simply regret for being caught. His lawyer sat beside him, stiff, careful, too polite now, as if afraid to touch a flame that had burned too hot to control. Justice Gomer entered moments later, robe sweeping across the floor like a curtain drawn before the last act. He carried no folders, no files, just his presence, which now felt less like that of a judge, and more like that of a man carrying the burden of knowing too much. He took his seat slowly, looking neither at Mary nor at Jonathan, but instead letting his gaze travel across the room, from corner to corner, as though examining the walls for the truth left clinging there. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual resonance. It wasn't weak, just quiet or restrained, as though he wanted his words to land gently. "We've seen what we needed to see," he began. "Not every truth comes dressed in drama. Some truths arrive with no footsteps, no sound, just the undeniable sense that something is not as it should be." He didn't point fingers. He didn't recite laws. He simply let the gravity of the last few days speak through him. Then, without preamble, he began reading the verdict, not as a performance, not as punishment, but as conclusion. The divorce was granted with immediate effect. All shared assets were awarded to Mary. Full financial control over the house, the stall, the accounts. Even the land Jonathan had tried to hide through legal tricks was uncovered by her lawyer and returned to her name. But it wasn't the assets that made the room stir. It was the protective order, issued with no expiration. Jonathan was forbidden from contacting, approaching, or involving himself in any matter tied to Mary, her name, her space, or her future. The sound of that decision settled into every breath in the room. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the bailiff stepped forward to collect final signatures. Jonathan, despite every effort to remain composed, hesitated before taking the pen. His fingers twitched. The pen wobbled slightly as he wrote. His name came out shaky, not from nerves, but from something deeper, a realization, perhaps, that control was no longer his to grip. When it was Mary's turn to sign, she did so with calm efficiency. Her signature was not rushed, but it wasn't labored either. It looked like a name written by someone who had reclaimed her right to own it. When the papers were filed and the session formally concluded, most people expected her to rise and leave, to walk out with the quiet grace she always carried. But instead, she remained seated, even after the room began to empty. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers loosely intertwined. She looked ahead, not at anyone, but at something distant only she could see. It was the look of someone who was no longer carrying the weight of proving anything. Jonathan stood slowly, unsure whether to approach her, unsure if he even should. But before he could take a step, the judge's voice echoed again. "Mr. Alden," he said, "it would be wise to understand that silence is no longer her defense. It is her power." And that was the last word spoken in the courtroom that day. Mary left the courthouse without ceremony. No reporters. No applause. No one followed her with questions or cries of support. But the eyes that watched her leave did so differently now. They did not see a woman unraveling. They saw a woman becoming. As she stepped into the open air, the wind picked up again, as if the town itself had been waiting for her. She paused at the top of the courthouse steps, not to look back, but to breathe, deeply, fully, without fear. It was the first breath in years that didn't catch in her throat. Her lawyer offered to escort her home, but she declined. "I'd like to walk," she said, her voice steady. And so she did. She walked through the center of Aku Hills with nothing in her hands but her dignity. People made room for her without being told. Shopkeepers stepped aside. Children, unaware of the full story, stared up in quiet awe. Old friends, if they could still be called that, nodded with lips pressed tight. No one asked her anything, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full of recognition. She passed her old stall and didn't stop. She passed the bakery and didn't wave. When she reached the bend near the churchyard, she looked at the tree she used to rest beneath on Sunday afternoons, back when she believed she would never have a life outside that marriage. And then, without looking back, she kept walking, not toward exile, not toward hiding, but toward something entirely her own. The house she returned to was no longer the one she had left behind. The keys still turned the same way in the lock, and the walls still bore the marks of old paint and time, but something inside it had shifted. It no longer loomed over her like a silent threat or a monument to her silence. The rooms, once heavy with the smell of restraint and unspoken sadness, now simply smelled like dust and forgotten lemons. She stood at the threshold for several minutes, fingers grazing the frame of the door, not to feel for strength but to remind herself she was real. She walked through the front room slowly, her steps echoing against the wooden floor as though the house itself wasn't sure how to welcome her. Everything remained in its place, his trophies on the mantel, the wedding photo still in its frame, the mismatched armchair he never let her sit in, but nothing could touch her now. She wasn't afraid of ghosts anymore. She walked past the photo without flinching, opened the window without checking first for permission, and stood where she had once been shouted into stillness without apology. The silence in the house no longer pressed against her. It moved with her. It belonged to her. And for the first time in a very long time, the house felt like it was listening, not watching. That night, she didn't pack her bags. She didn't run. She sat in the middle of the kitchen, her feet bare against the tile, a single candle flickering near the windowsill. There was a sense of ceremony in her stillness, but it wasn't for show. It was a moment she owed herself, the reclaiming of space not by force, but by refusal to flee. She brewed tea not because she needed comfort, but because she wanted to taste something warm that she made just for herself. There had been no celebration, no party, no neighbor offering congratulations. What would they even say? You survived? We didn't know. She didn't expect anything. She wasn't bitter, just clear-eyed. She knew people remembered what made them comfortable and forgot what made them complicit. There had been years when she might have begged for their voices, their concern, their action, but that need had burned away long before the courtroom. Now she sat alone, and it was the sweetest solitude she had ever known. No performance. No pretending. The flicker of the candle cast her shadow against the wall, and for once, she didn't look smaller in its reflection. She looked whole. She didn't move until the candle burned halfway down, and the tea had long gone cold. Then she stood, picked up the cup, washed it slowly, and placed it upside down to dry. That, too, was a choice. She turned off the lights herself. She went to bed when she was ready. She lay on the side of the bed she had never been allowed to sleep on, not because it was more comfortable, but because she could. Word of the trial moved through Aku Hills like a story that didn't quite know how to end. Some told it with guilt, others with disbelief, and a few with twisted satisfaction, as though scandal made their days less dull. But no matter how the story was told, one detail never changed. Everyone who heard it asked the same question. Is it true that the judge stood for her? That moment had etched itself into the town's imagination. Not the evidence. Not the verdict. Not the videos or the bruises or the stolen accounts. It was the image of the judge, a man who represented the law, rising to his feet for a woman everyone thought had nothing to rise for. And that moment did something strange to the people. It unsettled their assumptions. It forced them to look at their own quiet households, their own neighbors, their own dinner tables. Because if a judge could stand for her, what had they been doing sitting for so long? Some tried to rewrite their roles, claiming they always suspected something was wrong. Others avoided the subject altogether. But a few, just a few, began to visit her stall at the market when she returned weeks later. They didn't apologize. They didn't offer pity. They simply bought soap and said thank you, and in their eyes was the slow, uncertain flicker of acknowledgement. Mary didn't need anything more. She sold her products, smiled gently, and went home without waiting for anyone to catch up. Months passed, and Mary began making changes to the house. Not big ones, but thoughtful. She replaced the curtains with soft linen that let in the morning light. She repainted the hallway in a muted tone that felt less like hiding and more like exhaling. The trophies disappeared one by one, boxed and stored and then, quietly given away. She didn't rush to erase everything, only what no longer belonged. She reopened old notebooks from years past, the ones she had hidden in the attic, and began writing again. Not about the marriage. Not about Jonathan. About herself. About places she remembered before she became a wife. Names she had once been called with pride. Dreams she had shelved like unused spices. Her writing wasn't poetic or dramatic. It was clean, firm, truthful. Like her. She found herself walking more, taking long, slow strolls through the fields beyond the river where she used to sit and wonder if life would ever change. She no longer wondered. She watched the sky. She fed stray cats that appeared on her porch. She played records she had once loved but had been told were too noisy. She hummed along. She even began reading again, novels about women who left, who fought, who found themselves in the aftermath of ruin. Not because she saw herself in them, but because she no longer had to. She had her own story now, one that she didn't owe anyone, one that began not when the judge stood for her, but when she stood for herself. No matter how quiet your voice may seem to the world, never forget, it holds the power to shake walls, change stories, and set you free. Silence doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it's the space where courage is gathering strength. Choose peace, but not at the cost of your dignity. And when it's time to speak, let your truth rise without apology. May you never be buried in silence too deep for freedom to find you. May your spirit stay rooted like a tree in stormy winds, unshaken by noise or neglect. May your truth rise like dawn, soft, steady, undeniable. May your peace not be borrowed from fear, but owned with confidence. And when your time comes to walk away from what broke you, may your steps be light, your heart be whole, and your future shine with the kind of healing no one can steal. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.